Yeah. They made 100. He finally became the mayor.
So. Okay. I have a few minutes. Yeah. All right. All right. Good evening, and we're ready. I think we're gonna get ready to start, even though I know some people will roll in slowly because something is up with the traffic now. I don't know what it is, but it was not easy getting here. I know that. So I'm really happy to welcome you all to the Corner Society for the History of Medicine. My name is Michal Raz, and together with Mr. Bob Riley, who is always waiting in the wings, ready to do something. Mr. Riley, do you want to come and say hello? We coordinate the Corner Society. Oh, yeah, it's Mr. Bob Riley. And we coordinate the Corner Society for the History of Medicine. The Corner Society for the History of Medicine was named after Dr. George Washington Corner, who was the first professor of anatomy at the medical center at the University of Rochester. When there was a big transformation in medical education, and they brought the biggest and finest professors here to teach scientific medicine. Amongst them was Dr. Corner. And he stayed here for a few decades of his career, and he founded in 1934 this society, which was more like a club for people who like history. And certainly we've changed over the decades and have developed a more professional interest in history, but we're proud to be the longest running society in the history of medicine in the country, at least as far as I can tell. I will take corrections, but I say this every year because we haven't found a longer running one. And we've been continuous apart from pandemics and world wars. So I think that's pretty awesome. And it speaks to the legacy of the humanities and history here at Rochester. So welcome. We have 3 lectures each semester, 6 lectures a year. We have a really exciting program. We partner with the Department of Health, Humanities, and Bioethics over the Medical Center. And we have a lot of support from our friends at River Campus, including Humanities Center and History, who have supported us in the past. All right. So welcome to our first kickoff lecture. And now I'm really excited to introduce Professor Jim Downs, who is our speaker for today. Jim is the Gilder Lehrman National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Civil War Era Studies and History at Gettysburg College. He is the author of 3 books, 2 of which I teach regularly, and the 3rd I know Joni Rubin here teaches, huge honor. So he is the author of Stick from Freedom, African American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, which was published by Oxford in 2012, Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation, which was Basic Books in 2016, and most recently, Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, published by Harvard in 2021. And this book has been translated into 5 languages and counting, include Chinese, French, Korean, Japanese, and Russian. And he's also the co-editor of a number of important volumes. He's an expert in Civil War and Reconstruction history, which is his basic training and discipline, but has become over the years a well-known and innovative scholar in the field of public health and epidemiology. And speaking to that, in 2015, he was awarded the Andrew W. Mellon New Directions Fellowship that allowed him to return to graduate school, where he gained postgraduate training in medical anthropology at Harvard University. So he truly does it all. Downs is the editor of Civil War History and is the recipient of numerous honors that, if I list them all, then it's going to take a very long time and we won't have time for a talk, but I'm going to say a few of them, which is he's the distinguished lecturer from the Organization for American Historians and has recently been elected to the Society of American Historians and the Royal Historical Society in the UK. Jim also takes the role of public intellectual very seriously and makes sure that his writing is accessible to a broader audience, and has published essays in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, New York Times, Vice, Slate, Lancet, and a few more, speaking to the really broad relevance of the work he does that looks at bigger histories of race, public health, and infectious disease. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him here to the Corner Society to kick off our series for the year. And thank you so much for coming out, and we're excited to welcome you here to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction, Mahal. I'm very thrilled to be here. I've had a wonderful day. I got to talk with faculty over lunch. I had a very inspiring conversation with the graduate students after lunch. And I even got to tour the cemetery with Wendy Gonover, who brought me to Frederick Douglass's gravesite, and then also to Amy Post, who was a main character in my first book, Sick from Freedom, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of seconds. I will be speaking extemporaneously for today's talk, but the only time that I will read will be for the first slide to just give you an overview of what the book project is and to get you oriented into what I'm trying to do in the book. So the title of the book is The Troubled and the Troubling Origin of Epidemiology, How Colonialism, Slavery led to the emergence of, or how it led to this new branch of medical science known as epidemiology. Colonialism, slavery, and war led to the creation of built environments, slave ships, plantations, battlefields, and other spaces that enabled physicians to visualize the spread of infectious disease. This reflected a turning point in the history of medicine when doctors moved away from thinking of supernatural forces or miasma theory as the cause of disease and began to investigate the spread of epidemics. I chart this development within the beginning of the field of chemistry in the 1750s and studies of air and ventilation to the creation of the first International Sanitary Commission that studied the spread of epidemics in the mid-19th century. So ultimately, what I'm really thinking about are the ways in which social history helped to create new ways of thinking about both medicine and science. So there have been doctors since Aristotle who were interested in epidemics and understanding how disease spread. And so we have tons of evidence of physicians throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout Asia, in parts of the Americas, who were all sort of grappling with this broader question of how disease spread, how epidemics erupted. But what I noticed was that the confluence of slavery, colonialism, and war not only gave way to major epidemic outbreaks, but it also gave way to new ways of thinking about how to study disease and the creation of new sort of methods in understanding how epidemics spread. A lot of times my students will say, well, were their ideas correct in terms of understanding the spread of epidemics? And the answer is they often were not correct in terms of how we understand epidemic spread today. But what they did do was build bureaucracies that helped to facilitate the creation of methods that provided the cornerstone for the history of epidemiology. So I'm going to begin by talking about, see here the slides. It's not obvious. I just need the arrow to go. Okay, so we'll just get that to move, and that'd be great. So I'm going to start by talking about how I actually got to this project. And I'm not going to I can spend probably way too long talking about my first book, but I'm going to just do it in a couple of seconds. My first book, Sick from Freedom, basically looked at the health conditions of formerly enslaved people. And so many historians of the Civil War recognize that the Civil War was the largest biological crisis of the 19th century, that more soldiers died from disease than from battle. But when it came to telling the story of emancipation of freed people, we often told it purely in terms of political mobilization, how Black people gained the right to vote, how they became citizens. These major events led to constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which absolutely matters, but they obscured and obfuscated the ways in which Black people entered into a world that was pillaged by disease. More soldiers during the Civil War died from infectious disease than from the battlefield. And yet we sort of memorialize the battlefield death as the center of morbidity and mortality. My research in Sick from Freedom pushed against the political narrative and said, that's one part of the story, but there's another story. What happened to formerly enslaved people as they freed themselves from slavery and entered into sort of new environments? And so what I uncovered were tons of different cases of medical disaster, everything from malnutrition to outbreaks of dysentery to other sort of problems that resulted from the lack of basic necessities. But the cornerstone of the research was that by using federal records found in the National Archives, I pieced together a smallpox epidemic that took the lives of roughly 60,000 formerly enslaved people. And just when that epidemic seemed to peter off by 1865, early parts of 1866, a cholera pandemic began, and it started in India, it moved into Russia, throughout Europe, crossed the Atlantic Ocean, eventually entered into Canada, New York, and then into the post-war South. So formerly enslaved free people were dealt with two major epidemics, the smallpox epidemic and the cholera epidemic. When doctors were trying to understand the smallpox epidemic, they blamed the epidemic on Black people. They said it was a result of their inherent susceptibility to disease. They argued that because they were intermingling, and that was the term they used was promiscuous, which was when men were living with women, that led to immorality, that then made them more vulnerable to the spread of illness. They had all of these sort of other sort of antiquated arguments about how it spread. What they didn't take into account was the fact that when smallpox was spreading among Union or Confederate troops, it would immediately take the infected person and isolate them to prevent the virus from spreading. During the Civil War, formerly enslaved people were crowded together in refugee camps. This is part of the history that's often not told. Forced to be in crowded conditions, a virus like smallpox spread exponentially. And yet the arguments that the newspapers developed and even the medical profession was that they blamed the virus on Black people. And then they even said, listen, we don't have enough manpower in order to actually fight off the smallpox epidemic. We don't have the doctors to respond to it. We don't have tents to create isolated areas. And we don't even have the bureaucracy in place in order to report on where the epidemic is moving and how we can best help people. And so when I read through a lot of these records, it seemed to make sense to me on one level. If you're a physician in Orangeburg, South Carolina, or in Shreveport, Louisiana, and you're reporting to Washington, D.C., that you need more materials to create a smallpox tent in order to vaccinate, in order to isolate an infected person, it's going to take time for that letter to eventually reach the nation's capital. And in that time, the virus can spread wildly. So some of that I understood as a sort of problem of the 19th century and also a problem of an early federal bureaucracy. But then at the height of the smallpox epidemic, a cholera epidemic blew up. And the federal government then developed an efficacious protocol in order to stop the spread of cholera. Smallpox had been around forever. They had known about smallpox, they had seen smallpox. Cholera was a relatively new disease to most 19th century Americans. And yet, during the 19th century, they were all of a sudden able to develop a protocol to further prevent the spread of cholera. So I wanted to know why. And so when I concluded Sick from Freedom, one of the arguments I made was, since cholera was affecting both Black and white residents, the federal government developed a bureaucratic network that actually sent dispatches across the country that provided information on prevention, that even gave little sort of chemical, sort of like tablets in order to purify the water. They engaged in a number of different practices that help to prevent the spread of cholera. And so as I was sort of finishing the book, I wanted to know a little bit more. How did the federal government develop an efficacious epidemiological response to cholera? Where did they get this information about cholera? And so what I knew was, in general, the history of epidemiology and the way that it typically gets narrated. So just for our purposes today, the 19th century definition of epidemiology is the study of how disease spreads across a population, and it's also how to control epidemics and how to prevent epidemics. The traditional story of epidemiology typically centers around a person by the name of Jon Snow, not to be confused with Jon Snow of Game of Thrones fame. And Jon Snow is an anesthesiologist, and ultimately he witnesses a cholera epidemic blowing up in a small section, in a poor section of London, and he goes to investigate it. When he goes into the neighborhood, he begins this investigative method to understand how cholera is affecting different people in a specific region. At the time, most physicians understood epidemics as a result of something known as miasma theory. And miasma theory simply postulated that anytime you had rotten vegetation or trash or excrement, what it would ultimately do is that it would emit a kind of a smell, a putrid odor. That odor would then sort of travel through the atmosphere. And the idea was that people would inhale that particular odor and become sick. So Snow is sort of aware of this theory, but he's interested in investigating how and why cholera spreads. So he starts knocking on people's doors, and he finds out in one particular house, everyone has it. In the next particular house, no one has it. In the next particular house, 2 people have it. In the next house, 1 person has it. In the next house, everyone has it. According to the theory of contagion, this doesn't make sense. Why is it skipping over certain individuals and even skipping over other houses? Snow then performs a postmortem evaluation on the bodies, and he notices that there's no, if in fact people did breathe in putrid air that was poisonous, their lungs would show some evidence of that, and there are no problems. He does, however, notice that their GI tract is compromised. So through a process of investigation, he ultimately, and I'm sort of truncating the story so it sounds like, realizes that cholera is spreading as a result of the water, that all of the people who actually are suffering from it at one point drank from this particular water pump. And so in 1850, he's engaged in an investigative practice that theorizes that cholera is the result of water transmission, bacteria in the water. It's before the age of microbiology and the use, and there's some use of microscopes to sort of see disease, but it's not that prevalent and that popular. So it's just an argument. He's then lionized as the father of epidemiology, and he deserves credit for actually identifying the culprit that caused the cholera epidemic. So I went to London to the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine and to the British National Archives because I wanted to know more about how people understood cholera, and more importantly, if in fact Snow's influence had an effect on American doctors after the Civil War in responding to the cholera pandemic. What I actually uncovered was that Snow was not the sort of lonely, intrepid pioneer who ventured into a poor section of London by himself. He was part of a larger cohort of physicians who were part of something called the London Epidemiological Society. Physicians were deployed throughout the British Empire, in the British Caribbean, in India, and in Africa. When they arrived in these areas, they were often assigned to protect the health and welfare of the crew, but they encountered major epidemic outbreaks, and they immediately needed to come up with a protocol on how to both control the spread of an epidemic, but also to help prevent it. They then use the military bureaucracy in order to create a network among each other, in order to share information and what they learned. In the beginning of the talk, I said there were lots of doctors since Aristotle and even earlier who thought about disease transmission. But how did those doctors actually communicate with each other? There were a couple medical journals here and there. There were definitely medical societies. But what I argue in my book is that the vast explosion of military bureaucracy created a network that allowed doctors to both facilitate their observations and turn them into theories, but it also created a network where they were able to gain a bird's eye view of a particular epidemic. So, for example, Gavin Milroy, who was stationed in Jamaica, was able to collect reports from doctors all over the British Caribbean, as well as the French Caribbean, and even in the American South, in order to learn about how cholera was progressing. Otherwise, doctors who were either in a small village in Paris or someplace in Italy or even in parts of Asia, there wasn't necessarily a network that helped to facilitate knowledge production. Military bureaucracy created a sub-regime of knowledge production, I argue, that helped doctors to learn about the spread of disease. When they returned to London, they realized that they gained important expertise about the transmission of disease, about how to control disease, and about how to prevent disease. And so they would actually meet in rooms like this and share their theories and ideas. Now, at this point in the talk, you could say, okay, Down, so what's surprising and what's new? All right, well, on one level, Snow is not just a lonely pioneer. He's part of this cohort of other physicians who are engaging and innovating new investigative methods to understand epidemics. So what's my point? To sort of make a lateral move, to simply say that Snow's not by himself, but he's part of a larger context. In part, that's a piece of the argument. But when I looked more closely and more rigorously at the material, I started realizing that these doctors were able to visualize the spread of infectious disease, depend on military bureaucracy, because colonialism, imperialism, and slavery had created built environments that provided them with a bird's eye view to develop new theories that actually undergirded the burgeoning field of epidemiology. So what I'm saying is not just Snow is part of a larger cohort of physicians, but rather how did the institutions of slavery and colonialism create built environments that facilitated this form of knowledge production. And so I'm interested in how these major social forces are part of a branch of medical science that has actually guided us through the pandemic. So let me explain a little bit more by giving you a quick example. Snow's study is happening in the late 1840s and the early 1850s. He does 3 various experiments. Prior to that, I'm going to tell a story about a guy by the name of John McWilliam and his epidemiological investigation that actually predated Snow and helped to create this sort of foundation for modern epidemiology. So in 1846, a ship known as the Eclair goes to the west coast of Africa around Sierra Leone, and it's there to police the west coast of Africa for any sign of the illegal slave trade. And many of the men who enlist in this endeavor are promised a ton of prize money if they can find evidence of the trafficking of enslaved Africans to any part of the Americas. They cruise up and down the coast of Sierra Leone. They find no evidence of it, and so they have to head home. On their way home, they stop at Cape Verde, which is under Portuguese control. There, they want to have a good time, ultimately. So they go and they go off the ship, they meet people in the town, they party for a couple of days. 3 of the guys end up going missing. And as the ship eventually heads back to London, a yellow fever outbreak erupts onto the ship. And what it does is it leads to a major debate in London about quarantine. And so when I was doing the research for this project, I thought, oh my gosh, it sounds antiquated talking about quarantines. It was in 2014, 2015. And I thought, I'm going to really have to explain a lot to readers about lockdowns. I'm going to have to explain a lot to readers about the difference between what's good for the public good, the health of the economy versus the health of individual people. And in actuality, unfortunately, the pandemic has sort of crystallized all of these debates for you. So you could sort of imagine there were merchants in the mid-19th century who were saying, we absolutely need to keep this ship in quarantine, we need to keep it isolated because no one's going to want to trade with us if we're not following this protocol. Other people are saying, we absolutely can't keep it in quarantine because no one's going to want to trade with us if they think we have infected goods. And so it leads to this huge debate. The British military and the medical profession are also debating it in rooms like this about what's the best course of action. Meanwhile, the people on the ship are, suffering because they don't have food and they've been on the ship for a really long time. And so ultimately, the government sent a guy by the name of McWilliam to Africa to investigate the cause of this fever. And so this is a really interesting moment. Nick Williams, a trained physician, he was on expeditions to Africa. In fact, last week I was in London and I was going through his earlier notes that are in the British archives about his earlier expeditions in the 1840s. And I'm happy to share some of that research with you during the Q&A. When he arrives to the area, he, as a British official, is able to set up shop in the Portuguese office. And basically, he demands all of the washerwomen who were allowed onto the ship to clean the soiled linens, he gets them into the office to interview them. Now, there's about 12 to 14 women, and these women provide detailed information about the incubation period of yellow fever, about its major hallmark, major symptom, which is black vomit. They even trace where they believe the virus moved from the ship to the guard station to other parts of the island. And so they become, in many respects, these sort of original contact tracers. Now, I want to sort of step outside just because this is a room full of medical historians. And I want to talk a little bit about the documents here. And I went too far. Okay. There we go. Okay, so it's 2014. And I am really curious about why and how people understand cholera, how they understand infectious disease. I go to the Wellcome Institute, I fly all night, I arrive in the morning, I'm jet lagged, I'm tired, I run into the rare books room, I pull out all of the different slips that I want to see, and then it's time for me to maybe go downstairs, have coffee, have a chocolate cake, a chicken sandwich, who knows. But something tells me I'm going to go walking around the stacks, and it's sort of like books like this. There's like clinical hematology. I want to see what they have in their open stacks. And I pull a book off the shelf and I open it up and I see this page and it says Johanna, a mulatto, native of San Antonio. So, okay, age 59. How long have you been on the island? 16 years. Where do you live? And she says in Porto Sal Rey, do you recollect when the soldiers came to the house? Yes. Were they sick? Then they ask all of these questions. Did this person have black vomit? Yes, for some hours. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, what is this? Like, look back to the cover. Is it 1946? No, it's 1846. And then I was really stunned. When I did the research for Sick from Freedom, Sick for Freedom, I actually got the title of my own book wrong in public on tape. Sick for Freedom. Here we are, Sick for Freedom. It's Sick from Freedom. All right. When I was doing research for Sick from Freedom, I was basically using fragments in the National Archives. So maybe some doctor would say 60 people had smallpox, that would be it. Someone else would say, we need more clothes. Someone else would say, we should shut the hospital for the freedmen. That was it. And I had to basically piece together these fragments in order to reconstruct an epidemic. I have never seen in over 15 years, and I still haven't now, it's over 20 years, an encyclopedic account that takes the testimony of enslaved and colonized people of color and actually verbatim copies down their reactions, their insights, and their observations about an epidemic. This was mind-blowing. And so I spent way too much money photocopying it and bringing it back to the US. And then I worked on other parts of the book. A couple of years later, a major historian, I won't mention his name, Mark Harris, from the University of Oxford, publishes a book on quarantine. And he has a chapter about the Cape Verde. And my heart sunk. I thought, oh, wow, I've been sitting on this, but I had to work on these other chapters. What happened? And I started thinking, I've never seen anything in print about this, and now he has a chapter. I went through his chapter, I read it twice, and there was not one reference to the washerwomen. So I mention this really for the undergraduates because historians, we are social scientists. So on one level, we are scientists. We must use evidence. We must, have a particular method, but we are humanists. So our interpretation changes. So it's just like when you're doing a literature class. Why does the wife of Bath matter in Chaucer? You could say for this reason, or she doesn't matter. It's an interpretation that we have. So Mark's book is really important because it helps us understand the history of quarantine and what mattered, but his orientation as a historian is a lot different. He followed the logic of the doctors and he followed the logic of the government to understand how quarantine worked. I was trained as an English major at the University of Pennsylvania in the 90s when Black feminist theory was in many ways trying to uncover the subjectivity of people of color and of women in classical literature, in Western literature. So the question would be for lots of Black feminist scholars at this particular time, okay, we understand there's these major, what they called in the 1980s, the canon wars. Harold Bloom and other people at Yale, they would basically say, the real literature is Chaucer and Shakespeare. And then what does that mean for someone who is interested in people of color or in women or in other marginalized groups? What happened is beginning that came out of the streets, that came out of the community were anthologies like All the Women Are White, All of the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. This is actually what provided the theoretical foundation for what is known as intersectionality. That then leads to books like Hazel Carvey's Reconstructing Womanhood, which is about thinking about the subjectivity of Black women in both Black literature, but also Toni Morris's book, Playing in the Dark. This is not a novel, this is her nonfiction work, which is what do you do with the representations of race? How do you think about how these representations are at work in white literature? So when I read the sources, I'm not reading them from simply the vantage point of the doctor. I'm looking at the clues of Black people who may only appear as in a cameo, they may only have a cameo appearance in the text. We don't have lots of answers about them. We don't have their birth records. We don't have all the questions that even social historians want to have, their death records. We don't know much about them. But my reading and my training in literature helped me to flip the script and say, these people who only have a cameo appearance, how can we turn them into the protagonists of the story? And what I soon uncovered was that these women were really responsible for tracing the epidemic. Their testimonies provided really important evidence about yellow fever and they helped the doctors understand where it was actually moving along these islands. And so ultimately, my argument is they were the first contact tracers, but their knowledge helped to solidify this sort of method of epidemiology, of taking ordinary people's observations about disease, collecting it and studying it, and helping to sort of use it to create a broader understanding of an epidemic. What I found so shocking was these women had no idea that weeks after an epidemic took the lives of so many of their friends, their family members, their neighbors, that a British official would be arriving in their village and then forcing them to answer questions about it. But they had collected the knowledge themselves, and they knew it. They had perfected this knowledge about the epidemic, and that's what helped lead to the sort of understanding of a certain set of methods to create a framework for epidemiology. So when we have John Snow, who's basically often credited for creating, and he should be, an aerial map that provides a bird's eye view of the cholera outbreak in London, we can also see in McWilliams' book efforts to create aerial displays of how the actual epidemic was moving and where it was moving. And where does that knowledge come from? It didn't derive from McWilliams. It derived from the women who were the contact tracers, who were actually creating a map through their narratives. And so when we think about how did epidemiology as a field develop, we often credit Snow, but this particular case in 1846 was a British sensation. It made news all over the press. It was something that was debated in the Epidemiological Society, and Snow was colleagues with McWilliams. And so what we have done is that we have over the years lionized Snow, and he should be lionized, and he should be credited for his important theory. But he also needs to be placed in context that there were other doctors who were doing this work, and the knowledge that they developed, the epidemiological methods that they created, were not just a product of their genius and their brilliance, but it came from what was happening on the ground and how local people, as a result of imperialism and colonialism, created a built environment that helped to facilitate the production of knowledge. So ultimately, the Epidemiological Society gets founded in 1850. So when I was thinking about my book, I thought, okay, we have the cholera pandemic in the US in 1866, and American doctors were able to efficaciously control the spread of the pandemic in 1866. Well, they may have learned from the British doctors and the Epidemiological Society in 1850. But as a historian, I wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation. I wanted to know what happened before 1850. I found evidence in the 1830s, the 1820s, the 1810s, 1790s, 1760s. Still lots of evidence of doctors developing epidemiological methods to understand the spread of disease. And then I hit a sort of wall in the 1760s. And so what I discovered was one of the most important case studies to think about how disease spread or how crowded conditions led to illness was a sort of story that many have seen as sort of a legend, and it's a problematic story, and my footnotes acknowledge that, but it's a story about something known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. And ultimately, what happens is a bunch of British prisoners of war are crowded together in a tiny jail cell. While they're in there, they're ultimately suffocating, and they beg the guard for water. And the guard agrees. So the men take their hats, they pass it through the window, the window here, and the guard puts water in it, and then he passes it through. So it creates lots of chaos in this room. The stronger men overpower the weaker ones. but they have reverence for their commanding officer. They give the commanding officer a hat filled with water. He drinks it. He does not feel relieved. And at this point, he feels like he's going to die. So by accident, he ends up someplace underneath the opening here. When he experiences a bit of fresh air, he all of a sudden feels restored. And so this example becomes a touchstone medical example throughout medical history throughout the 19th century, that air changes its quality in crowded conditions. Now, you and I are saying, that's obvious. You could have, like, someone in kindergarten could have figured this out. But in the 18th century, in the 17th century, what are the environments, the social spaces where people are crowded together? Prisons, where people are crowded together due to a lack of ventilation and are suffering from all kinds of infectious diseases and lack of ventilation. But it's a dispossessed, marginalized population. So with the exception of a handful of reformers, no one cares. Hospitals. Hospitals in the 18th century are also crowded and also for marginalized, dispossessed people, so no one cares. So ultimately, air is changing its quality and people are suffocating, but they don't know chemically why that's actually happening. At the same time, you have you have the development of oxygen. European thinkers in London, Germany, and France are all using in their laboratories. This is the birth of chemistry. They're using pneumatic troughs, sort of devices that are capturing gases, and they're sort of looking at how these various devices reflect how air changes its quality. And so if this was a general history of science 101 class, I could talk to you about Lavoisier or Boyle and all of these different people who are thinking about air changing its quality as a result of laboratory experiments. But as a social historian, I'm committed to thinking about how people on the ground understood this. And the black hole at Calcutta becomes a potent illustration that air is changing its quality as a result of overcrowding. But the black hole at Calcutta is only one example. The emergence of chemistry is dependent upon another major factor that's happening during the 1750s, and that's the transatlantic slave trade. This sort of the violent predicament of subordinating people and placing them at the bottom of slave ships creates crowded conditions that actually crystallizes new understandings about oxygen and shows the need and the demand for ventilation, and that the transatlantic slave trade then becomes the origin story, in my opinion, of the beginning of epidemiology, because it produces a large number of case studies that show both how disease spreads, but also more importantly in its earlier iterations, and what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of tonight, how air changes its quality. So this is okay. So this is an iconic representation of the Brooks slave ship, and the Brooks slave ship has often been used as a way by abolitionists, British abolitionists, as a way to describe the poor conditions of enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade, and it was used, part of the depiction of it depended upon a testimony by a guy by the name of Dr. Thomas Trotter. And Dr. Thomas Trotter describes going to the bottom of the ships where people are, quote, stowed spoonways, where people are placed in small cabins that are no more than 5 feet wide, and that he feels that he can't even breathe in these areas. And so his testimony ultimately leads to this illustration. And so what I did in my research was I was going through records of the Lancet, which is the major medical journal of the 18th and 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, when doctors are talking about oxygen as a category and the need for ventilation, they refer to Thomas Trotter's observations on the brooks, and they use it as a potent example of how air changes its quality. So I can still remember I was reading through documents on the Lancet on their online website when I was in a coffee shop, and I couldn't believe it. I thought I didn't know that the discussions about ventilation, chemistry, and fresh air, and even oxygen became crystallized as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. But as a social historian, I thought, well, wait a minute. I always have to doubt myself in this process of research. And I said, well, this is just one source. Maybe it's just one example of one medical journal that traces the history of ventilation to the transatlantic slave trade. But as I went and investigated further, I came across the research of Stephen Hales. And Stephen Hales is known, he's a clergyman and he's a chemist, but one of the most important things that he does is he begins the practice of creating a mechanical ventilator that's designed to promote circulation to help improve the air quality. And so if you know anything about sort of, when you think about the history of science, or you think about your own writing, I apologize that I must be pressing this too hard. Okay, so when he publishes his findings, most people look at his most polished, his most edited version. I looked at that version, and it's basically on ships and ventilation. When I went to his earlier treatise, I noticed that it says an account of the great benefit of ventilators in many instances in preserving the health and lives of people enslaved in other transport ships. During this period, the ships had crowded people together to such extreme measure in the way that Trotter actually testified, many were dying of suffocation. Stephen Hales then develops the ventilator to promote circulation. Now, one of the things that I was doing in the British Archives, I couldn't tell you the students, but I can tell you today, was, all right, were these naval physicians actually reading his theories about ventilation? And what I found even this past week were doctors saying, we're sending the reports on the ventilators that we've created, and we're asking Dr. Stephen Hales to review it to make sure that what we're doing is actually workable. So you can see both in the scientific discourse and the published treatise that he's thinking about slave ships, but then you can see in the everyday iterations of like basic correspondence that his ideas are sort of funneling through the discourse about ventilation. But even more shocking was that captains of slave ships begin sending reports to him talking about how effective the ventilators were on the ship. And then these captains use the voices of enslaved Africans to endorse the fact that ventilators are effective, so that they don't even realize that their voices are being used to actually codify a major scientific transformation and are being used to sort of talk about this technology. So I'm just going to read one. So in order to provide the need for ventilators on ships, he writes, I was informed that in a Liverpool ship that had ventilators, not one of the 800 slaves died, except the child who was born in the voyage. He further added that in many other slave ships without ventilators, there died 30, 40, 50, or 60 in a ship. Hales included a letter from a French doctor in his 1758 treatise who claimed that ventilators on ships decrease the mortality rate from 1/4 of those valuable in cargoes to less than a 20th. So I think this is important for a couple of different reasons. One, it shows how the transatlantic slave trade created a built environment that led to this major scientific understanding of oxygen and then the technological development of the ventilator. But then I think it really also matters from a curriculum perspective. oftentimes, for those of us who work in African American studies or in women and gender history, we are often sort of burdened to say, we are going to do all of the heavy lifting in order to diversify the curriculum, in order to do DEI work. And so we're going to talk about Black people as political actors. We're going to talk about women like Susan B. Anthony. And then fields like math and science sort of get off the hook. And they're sort of reified as disciplines that have no connection to these moments and fields. And what I'm trying to sort of show in this work is that the field of chemistry is tethered to the transatlantic slave trade, that the field of technology that leads to the birth of the ventilator can't be told without the history of slavery. And that these fields that are often sort of seen as separate from the slavery are actually implicated in slavery. In fact, slavery helps to provide the many case studies that prove that oxygen, an element on the periodic table that we think is completely apolitical, actually derives from the exploitation and violence of enslaved people. So I had a strange chemistry teacher when I was in high school. I don't know why this happened. I think it was a form of cruel punishment. He made us memorize the periodic table. And so I've had a gripe with the, and she would say the first day of school, on Halloween, you will have the test in the periodic table. And I was like, I'm not wasting my intellectual energy on memorizing something that's available at the back of the textbook. But anyway, it's really interesting to sort of think about how that periodic table, which is seen almost as a naturalized form of knowledge, has a political and historical connotation that can be traced to the history of slavery. I'm sort of mindful of time. How are we? Wrapping up? Okay. So just really quickly on the language here, you can sort of see that he uses the term slaves in the 1756 treatise. And again, this is really important to think about how literary studies provides us with an important set of tools to do close readings, because when we get to the next version of it, sorry again, where are we? I'm not going to hit it hard. I'm just really, really sorry. Okay, so the final draft, there's no reference to slavery. It simply refers to as ships. So now slavery gets scrubbed clean from the record, even though slavery provided not only the evidence that helped to crystallize these new ideas, but it also now is sort of absent from the document. Now, the reasons why I'm not necessarily sure, it could be in response to the rising abolition movement. It could be because the term ships in the 18th century just meant slave ships. Most people would think that. It doesn't need to necessarily have the modifier, but I'm nevertheless, as a literary scholar doing work in history, interested in how language and words work. So to conclude, I'm just going to give one quick case study. Thomas Trotter, when he was on the Brooks, he goes to the bottom of the ship and he notices that many of the people are suffering from scurvy. So it's unclear if he has a translator, it's unclear if how he's communicating with the enslaved Africans, but they point to a hardness in their arm. He opens up their mouth, you can see sort of like their gums sprouting flesh. He notices that they obviously are presenting all of the symptoms of scurvy. Based on the lectures that he had attended in Edinburgh, he thinks the treatment ranges anywhere from providing them with wine to, quote, animal meat, or even citrus fruit. When the ship eventually arrives in Antigua, a Black woman walks onto the ship. Now, she only appears in the treatise in one line. But remember what I said about using Black feminist criticism. The simple cameo appearance of a marginalized character could potentially flip the script and offer a new narrative. She then provides all of the enslaved Africans with various citrus fruit. And Trotter then decides this is an opportunity for an experiment. As a physician, he may have seen scurvy once in a while, but ultimately not really sort of had the opportunity to really think about what is the most effective way of curing it. The number of enslaved Africans suffering from scurvy prompts him to do an experiment. And so he divided the group with symptoms of scurvy into groups of 3, gave limes to one group, green guavas to the second, and ripe guavas to the third. After a week, those who had eaten the ripe guavas had not improved, but the others did. And what he starts to notice is if they suck the juices directly from the citrus fruit, they then become relieved. And their health was restored by the time they got to Jamaica. It's very short ride. What's interesting is he goes back to Edinburgh. His mentor is about to lecture on scurvy, and he says, listen, I have a new theory that shows how you drink directly from the citrus fruit, it actually improves scurvy. And his advisor says, well, that's fine, but I'm going to go back to my lecture and I'm not going to include your findings. But Trotter is nevertheless intrepid, and he publishes an article that proves his findings. It's published first in England, then in Germany, and then eventually in Philadelphia. What I find so interesting is that in his analysis, he uses the language of based on a multitude of cases. He doesn't use the term slavery. The multitude of cases is an empirical language that describes a clinical experience that erases slavery from the process of knowledge production. He recognizes that he needs to assert that his finding is not based on 1 or 2, but on many. And what he does is he's using the institution of slavery and how slavery created a laboratory on board the ship in order for him to follow the experiment. So what we can start to begin to sort of see in the history of science and epidemiology is that in the early drafts of a lot of their writing, these doctors are explicitly talking about slavery. But by the time they publish their final piece, slavery gets struck clean from the record. Is this purposeful? Is it not? Unclear. It's my job as a historian to actually track the ways in which slavery created these built environments that led to new ideas, including epidemiology. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for a really fabulous lecture. And we do have some time for questions, and I can run the microphone around. We're going to have a couple in the microphone so that our colleagues on Zoom can hear them.
Sure.
Thank you so much. In high school, my entire high school had to read ghost maps. And
Great.
I was in London on the eve of lockdown, made a pilgrimage to John Snow's Lover's home. So this all resonated with me. So thank you. Interestingly, John Snow also was heavily influential on urban planning.
Right.
But one question I had was separate from this is to what extent do you see maybe origins of this in earlier conditions of situations? Like I know as a potential historian that medieval city dwellers were spreading diseases like wildfire. Peasants were living in cramped quarters and easily dying from plague.
Sure.
So, you know, to what degree does this hinge on slavery, and to what degree can we also maybe call this a kind of sedimentary story where there's origins that are even earlier than these?
So what I'm really interested in thinking about is there are other examples of crowded conditions, and people think about that a lot in terms of the French poor, the British poor, et cetera. But what I'm really interested in thinking about is the field of epidemiology begins in 1850, and it draws on the immediate experiences of imperialism and colonialism. And when you stretch that timeline back to the 1750s and to the whole of Calcutta, you start to see a new way of thinking that's in many ways buttressed by the creation of chemistry as a field. So that's the reason why my temporal parameters are set at 1750 to 1850. It's not to say that there weren't these other cases, but in those periods, they would often attribute miasma to it, miasma as a result, or they would look at social status or morality, all other kinds of narratives they would sort of deploy in order to understand it. They weren't giving like a scientific explanation of what's happening to the air in that product condition. It could just be a description in their account of the poor people or how they were actually becoming sick. So I think what I'm really interested in is the move when it actually becomes scientific and it gets buttressed by these new developments, namely the field of chemistry, but then the field of epidemiology.
Can I appreciate a little bit, but does it become scientific because at that moment it's terrestrial rather than supernatural? You talked about the supernatural very early on.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what's the threshold at which one determines what's scientific at this moment?
Right.
Because we actually have a long array here, and you can do
Right.
like a Colonialism thing and go back. Right?
Sure. So there's always, I mean, one of the things about the supernatural, and I do this all the time with my students, if I draw a timeline, when you're looking at like from BCE to the present, there's definitely supernatural explanation. Think about people getting the diagnosis today for cancer. People are still going to pray. They have a scientific understanding from their oncologist, but they're still using prayer as a way to better understand it. The supernatural doesn't actually evaporate, but what I'm really interested in is how these fields are actually getting developed. So one of the things I think about, and maybe a better way of understanding is, I teach a course called Narratives of Illness. And so people on the ground are always developing stories that rationalize the spread of sickness. And so those stories can be supernatural, those stories can be scientific, they range. What I'm interested is, how did this field of epidemiology begin and where did it begin? And so it may have began just among 50 people, and thousands of people may have been crediting the cholera epidemic to supernatural forces. But the emergence of the field is connected to these other social transformations.
This seems to be the table question. And I for some modern architectural history and urban planning, ask the medievalist question. As a medievalist, I'm going to ask a question about the 19th century. I find your argument like super intriguing and also challenging in certain ways, because when I talk to my students about Black Death, and one of the things I like to do is talk about the way that Black Death has been framed in the modern era. And I love this analysis by Faye Getz that puts all modern stories about the Black Death originating in Juften Hecker's 1832 treatise on der Schwarze Tod, which is presented as sort of a work by the founder of epidemiology. Okay. So I'm wondering two things. One is, where is the angle for perhaps German epidemiology? I'm thinking about Hecker, but I'm also thinking about Richard Evans' wonderful book about cholera in Hamburg in the 19th century.
Yeah.
That's so richly detailed, in part because all these rich details were kept in Hamburg. Were those all related to colonialism and slavery? I think they were related to perhaps merchant interests and political control of the city. So I'm wondering if this English story is perhaps a part of a bigger picture, and how do you want to relate your story to what I think is, I mean, let alone, usual medievalist comment, of course we invented all that. But how your story relates to a more maybe pan-Western at least development of epidemiology.
So okay, so the notion of epidemiology and its first use comes from the British. So that's why my focus is on the British. It's not to say there aren't other ways of thinking about it, but the creation of the epidemiological society and the way that epidemiology is taught in every public school of public health is a British story. The Hamburg book is a little bit later. What I did do, and my editor told me I have to take it out, was that when I was doing the research, I went to Prague. I went to the Spanish archives. I went to all over Europe. And what you start to sort of see in those records is something very similar. So in the records in Prague and in Budapest, you get to sort of see state officials who are reporting on epidemics. I'm not necessarily seeing I'm not seeing them like in conversation with the British, but you sort of see the creation of a modern state thinking about public health. What I'm interested in is less that and more about how the transatlantic slave trade creates this massive bureaucracy that facilitates knowledge production at the same time as the British Empire creates a massive bureaucracy, at the same time as the Crimean War and the Civil War do, and the way that those three bureaucracies are actually talking to each other, and the way that they're using information to help understand science. So the example would be that the piece that I could have added a chapter would be Egypt. Egypt is a central site, and Constantinople, where they're gathering information. Same with Malta, but Malta does appear in the book. So I'm interested in less about the expansion of public health authorities at the state level that are actually doing this work, and more about how the bureaucracy that these major social transformations create the network that lead to the epidemiological society, because the epidemiological society is comprised of doctors who are all throughout the empire. So that's the first piece of it. The Spanish records are really interesting to me, especially as a US historian, because when I went to the records in Sevilla, I was very interested in Cuba. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense as an American historian looking at the Caribbean, Cuba matters. But when you're sitting in the Spanish archives, like Cuba is nothing. It's the Philippines, it's Colombia, it's Mexico City. And so there's a whole desk on just the Philippines. And so all of a sudden I got reoriented in those records. And in those records, I looked at the Spanish is ultramar, the overseas records. And so those records were really reporting the same thing about you would have officials on the ground that the information would flow back to the metropole. In the Spanish and in the French case, it doesn't lead to the organization in the same way of epidemiology, in the same way that it does with the British. The French are known for their clinical hospitals, so they believe, even though they're getting information from other parts of the French Empire, they kind of think that everything that they need to know is coming out of their hospitals. And I'm sure like tons of books in this room are from that moment in the 1840s. But I just really want to emphasize that you see in the 19th century the growth of public health. You see it even in places like New York City and Hamburg and other places. That's not what I'm trying to sort of think about. What I'm thinking about is how does colonialism, by its very nature, help to create an investigative model? And one of the things that happens in colonialism with someone like Gavin Milroy is he can see all of the ways that the epidemic is blowing up throughout Jamaica. He can also get reports about how it's blowing up in Barbados, how it's blowing up in Cuba, and how it's blowing up in the southern United States. The Europeans are limited by their national boundaries. Colonialism creates the bird's eye view that allows them to see the epidemic. And that's what actually leads to, when COVID broke out, Fauci being able to say, this is what's happening in Iran, this is what's happening in Wuhan. That surveillance, that notion of medical surveillance, has its genealogy in colonialism. And that's what I'm trying to sort of say. And that's separate from small local and state and even national governments developing research to think about public health.
So they mentioned before that Hale's original treatise included 19 slaves, but like its final draft never included any mention of slavery whatsoever. And especially because you mentioned other authors have published previously talking about the origins of epidemiology without any mention of the Rockwoodans, especially who are the original contact. So based on this, how can we change the general conception about this topic and the origins of epidemiology, especially asking about like Black feminist techniques to tackle this area?
Right. So it's up to a younger generation of scholars to do the work and provide the evidence and to actually show these other accounts. I mean, this is what's so great about doing history is that there's lots of stuff on Hales that's really important and really matters. We're not throwing Hales out. We're saying that I unraveled a clue about how slavery helped to shape his thinking. Further research can look at other doctors, other thinkers, and sort of study the ways in which slavery helped to influence their thinking. And then it comes down to a single book is not going to change the thinking. It has to be adopted into curriculum, and then it has to be adopted into a textbook. Like that's the point. When I did Sick from Freedom, I wrote over 100,000 words, which is, you know, a decent amount. But I realized if that entire book can be reduced to one sentence that could make it into a textbook, then I'm fine. All I really want a textbook to say is in the 1,200 words they have on the Civil War, there was a smallpox epidemic that took the lives of 60,000 former slaves at the moment of freedom. That's all. So a lot of times we're doing the research that's providing the raw material that hopefully a textbook or somebody else will make it that information more knowledgeable. And then it's about, you know, how people read it. The Lancet actually picked up my stuff. I will be having something done. The Lancet picked up this story and they wrote a special article saying that, you know, this piece about rethinking the origins of epidemiology by tracing it to violence and colonialism is really important, and it's and called for like a reckoning of that. And now the Lancet's involved actually in this major investigation of its own origins and how, you know, it benefited from knowledge that was obtained as a result of colonialism. So that's like one clear sort of process.
So we had the historian class, historically learning, but I wanted to ask about the methodology of the epidemiology at the time. So right now, if we look at the field of epidemiology, we've got questions of causation, strength of association between exposure and outcome. So did you see in these early texts, you know, discussion or, you know, deliberation about these broader questions within epidemiology, or, you know, how the methodology?
Sure. So one of the biggest pieces, and I wrote my second chapter about this, was about contagion. So contagion was often considered to be the sort of major way that people understood the spread of disease. And so what I used, some of the evidence I used was from continental, some from Malta, some from Africa, and it's all of these in India. Some of these doctors are stationed in these places, and they're saying contagion is not absolutely a valid way of thinking about the spread of disease. Now, why does that matter? Because it's connected to policies around quarantine. So if a ship arrives into a harbor and you believe that it's contagious, then you believe that it can affect everyone else. So people like Gavin Milroy and early epidemiologists formed a branch, a small subset of group called anti-contagionists. And the anti-contagionists were really opposed to this idea that disease just kind of spread, and they were much more interested in a kind of investigative approach that collected data. And their data was really interesting. It's mostly qualitative, it's some quantitative, really interesting, like on both sides of the Atlantic. A lot of medical records that are collected by states are mostly statistical evidence. So it's how many people are sick, how many people died, how many people were admitted. it's in that level, it's really hard to trace, like, you're not gonna be able to do a curve, you know, you're not gonna be able to illustrate it in some way, although some thinkers do. But what I sort of see is that move to quantitative thinking is designed to undermine contagion, because it's using a sort of statistical analysis to narrate the epidemic that upends a notion of purely like, oh, everyone just gets it.
Thank you so much. So I'm gonna try to, ask my usual, contrarian question. And see if I can formulate this. So there is a moral, uh, framework to your story that I said. And it's sort of like, we need to examine the roots of this discipline because it was founded on immoral practice, namely slavery, imperialism, too, if you're from a certain political vantage point. But I am not convinced that it matters that that this branch of medical science originated. It didn't. I guess what's facilitated by is really, that's the phrase you use.
Right.
Was facilitated
Right.
by these practices.
Right.
Because I see the practices as creating these conditions for investigation. I don't know anything really about this, so but my hunch would be along the lines of the methodologies were shaped as much by or more by intellectual discourse. I mean, I get that you're trying to locate scientific and medical history in social structures, but you know how you actually do the science. I don't really see it as originating in these immoral practices. First of all, I'm not convinced about that. But the second thing is that epidemiology seems to me to be a kind of unintended consequence of these immoral practices. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so I would just change, so I would not say this, I would not use morality as the contours that underpinned the talk. I would say it's about power. And I would say, how is power getting deployed? And so, but
well, I have no problem.
Yeah.
You know,
but what I'm saying is that I think it's about power, and I think it's important to really make that distinction, because when we think about this field does grow out of a violent abuse of power, and that's an important. I think to me that's the origin. The other origin is that within African, it's also like where you're oriented and where you're sitting as a scholar and to whom you're contributing. One of the big motifs within African American studies and within the history of slavery as of late has been to sort of argue that capitalism, and this is not, don't shoot the messenger, that capitalism originates during slavery. So that slavery is not just this 19th century institution that helped to increase, planters' wealth, slaveholders' wealth, but it actually had this rippling effect in the creation of an American economy. So this is all of the leading at Baptist, The Half That's Never Been Told, Sven Beckert's book. I mean, this is the hallmark. And so my point is to say the DNA of slavery is also imprinted on the development of science and epidemiology. That's the point, and that is the genealogy, and that's the story, whether and it's not a moral story, it's actually about where I'm situating myself as a historian in conversation with other historians of slavery who were thinking about how the institution of slavery had transformed so many aspects of society that we didn't realize. So there's that piece. Now the second piece that I think is really important, and I don't have a pen, so it was on the
Well, I said this was like an unintended
the
consequence.
understand. So yeah, that's exactly right. So I have something, that's exactly right. So that is right. So I have something on one of the slides and I can show it to you. Where will we find it? I think it's earlier. Okay, so this last piece, scholars often argue science leads to imperialism. So that if you look at the work of Ruth Rogalski in Asia, you look at the work of Warwick Anderson in the Philippines or other places, the argument is that one of the ways that imperialism worked was they used science to help in the creation of colonization. So science was a way, in Rogalski's work on Asia, to completely eradicate Asian cosmologies around disease and to replace it with bacteriology. Or in Warwick Anderson's work, it was designed as a way of ridiculing the native people in the Philippines and to implement American senses of power and civility, that American notions of hygiene justify colonization. My point is actually precisely what you said, is the opposite. My research explains how imperialism leads to science. You're 100% right. It's the unintended consequence that colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade give birth to a brand new piece of science. And that's what I think is really fascinating within the history of science. One, to see that the genealogy of a field of chemistry can be traced to slavery, but also for my colleagues that are working in the history of medicine and colonialism to say, science is not just the handmaid of imperialism, that during the violent takeover of these places, that process led to scientific ideas.
You know, you struck me talking about David Harvey and Morrison and literature, and I can feel your love for that. And then I think you said that you were trained in English.
Right.
So I wonder if you could just talk about how you think about the relationship between the literatures on the one hand and the history on the other. Practice.
Right. Yeah. So my undergraduate was in so my undergrad, my BA was in literature, my MA was in American Studies, my PhD is in history, and then I did a post something. I got the Mellon, as McCall said, in medical anthropology. It really taught me to think about how to read the sources, because from the vantage point of social historians, and I was trained by social and political historians, we would look at these sources and we would say, there's not enough information about these people. They often appear as only, like, as I mentioned in the second chapter of my book, by one name, as like the hospital attendant. And they would name the person that's completion sent that name, and then that would be it. And then I would look at the document a little bit more closely, and it became apparent to me that these doctors who were trying to theorize about contagion were using the hospital attendants to say, guess what? Contagion as a theory can't work because this person whose name is X would have been infected because they were changing the bed code, they were changing the bedding every day, blah, blah. Or this washerwoman who only appears in a paragraph, he matters. So it was about really doing a close reading and rethinking how to tell the narrative from their vantage. I mean, that's the most, I think, simplistic sort of way of describing it.
Was literary theory inform the way you think about narration and history?
I think it does. I mean, there's a lot in that moment. So when I was writing the chapter on Cape Verde, it's really important to think about this because Saidiya Hartman does a lot with something called critical fabulation. And many people think of critical fabulation as, oh, it's just your imagination and you've made stuff up. And with a historian, I would never make stuff up. But it would be, what do I know from the context? And how can I flip the story so I could talk about, like, for example, the washerwomen. If they don't narrate what they did in terms of how they wander, but I looked up and researched all of that, of what people in the 19th century did, and then I made that part of their story. Like, they had to haul firewood, they had to carry this, they used lime. And so it's really just taking these little clues of these marginalized people and then building the story around them. That's what Hartman does mostly in Venus of Two Acts, her article, which is part of this move, and then later in Beautiful Experiments and so forth. So it's basically giving you the license to take people that otherwise even the most sympathetic social historian might dismiss because they don't have much of an archival trace, and sort of portraying them as the leading protagonist.
Well, that was the end on. So thank you so much. I'm sure the audience all joined me and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Society, we send out 2 emails before each event. If you want to get on the list, please let me know. I would love to see all of you here for our next event, which is November 1st. We're having Professor Mara Mills from NYU come and think about history for the permanent. She's here for a joint visit with our partner IT. So she'll have a few other events while there's a period of say, but thinking kind of about a more disability studies angle, thinking about the history of impairment. So that will be next month, next month-ish, November 1st at our next meeting. So thank you all. Please eat some cheese, drink some wine before you leave. And maybe avail yourself of opportunity to ask a few more. Thank you all.
Just the link to, I don't want other people to file, you'll delete it. And do, is there a address for them or something?